people like me need to admit that we wouldn't be in this place of national urgency if not for white professed followers of Jesus.
On the line with us is John Pavlovitz. He's a writer, pastor, activist from Wake Forest, North Carolina. His latest book is Stuff That Needs to Be Said. And I'm a longtime subscriber to his newsletter on Substack. If you don't subscribe to it, it's free. It's really worth reading. It's thoughtful, thought-provoking. It's titled A Beautiful Mess. And if you just go over to Substack.com and plug in either John Pavlovitz, Pavlovitz, or The Beautiful Mess, it'll pop right up. Or you can just go to johnpavlovitz.substack.com. John, welcome to the program. Tell me, first of all, for people who are unfamiliar with you and your writings, give us a little bit about your background.
Well, I was a local church pastor for really about 30 years ago. I began, and as I moved my way through the churches, I began to realize there was a disconnect between the Jesus teachings that I grew up with and what I was experiencing in organized religion. And I began speaking out on matters of race and sexuality and gender, and eventually found my way unemployed. And because the system that I was in didn't allow for those kinds of questions, and I've spent the last decade or so in a virtual congregation of sorts, made up of people all over the planet, talking about these issues that matter so much to us: compassion, mercy, love, and justice.
Yeah, and it's important. What denomination were you with?
I was with the United Methodist Church.
It's a church I was raised in. It's a fine institution. So, John, I believe this is your most recent piece. If not, it's very close to it. A pastor's warning: we're not in a civil war, but a Christian Nationalist Holy War, and they must not win. You want to explain this?
Well, I think, Tom, as a person of faith who grew up in the church and a white person in America growing up in the church, people like me need to admit that we wouldn't be in this place of national urgency if not for white professed followers of Jesus and the plans that they have for this nation, which they're coming ever closer to being realized, are really subjugation of all of us under a conservative Christian theological rule. And so it's incumbent upon people like me, people of privilege, to speak out and to make sure that everyone understands how organized they are, how committed they are to this sort of damaging theocracy, and what we need to do to combat it.
For example?
Well, I think we need to make sure that we're building broad coalitions, because right now the battle is not conservative Christians versus progressive Christians. It's really about humanists and agnostics and atheists and Jews and Christians and Muslims getting together and organizing so that we can wield our collective power, because we're facing minority rule. And so we simply have to yield our majority more responsibly and in a more organized way.
I recall when the Reagan campaign brought George W. Bush in as an advisor, and he basically, and you know, Reagan and even George Sr., Bush Sr., his vice president, had both been pro-abortion, for example. In fact, the Bush family had a long history of supporting Planned Parenthood. Reagan, signed the nation's most liberal pro-abortion bill when he was governor of California. And George W. hooked them up with Jerry Falwell and Franklin Graham and, that whole crowd, Ralph Reed. And suddenly, and then, this got amplified during the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency with his 1,000 points of light. In other words, let's figure out ways to shovel taxpayer money into these churches, and in exchange for that, these churches will then basically tell their parishioners that they should be voting Republican. It seems to me like that major turning point, I think we can identify a few in American history, the Scopes trial, et cetera, but in the modern era, that major turning point was the Reagan and the Bush, the first Bush presidencies. And that the church, and I obviously, in the largest sense, certainly the Protestant Christian church, has been severely and it seems permanently corrupted by it. What are your thoughts on that analysis, and what would you add to it or dispute or fine-tune it?
No, I think it's accurate. Excuse me, Tom. But I think what's happened is during that time, moderate people of faith have slowly been squeezed out of a system where they no longer found themselves belonging. And so moderate people, progressive people of faith began to cede the conversation on religion to the religious right. That became the only voice. And people didn't just leave the church, the conservative church, they left church altogether. And so now we've got tens of millions of people of deep, profound faith who are no longer part of the conversation. They're not counted in all of these conversations that we have. And so I think that's been the hardest thing. It's decent people who have a spirituality that matters to them feel abandoned. And so we need to make sure that we reiterate our faith beliefs so that people know that there is a dissenting opinion out there.
Yeah. I lived in Germany for a year back in the 80s, and that seemed to be kind of the period of time when this great unchurching was happening, along with, this kind of shakeup in the evangelical community being promoted by, things like Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth and the Left Behind series and all these people who are, adopting this, late 19th century rapturism or whatever you want to call it. But one of the things I noticed in Europe was that the churches were just largely just ceremonial places. They were where you went to get married, where you went for a funeral. But the number of people who were actually showing up in church had just dramatically dropped by the 80s. I'm wondering what you think is driving this. I know that this is a trend that is continuing here in the United States as well. Obviously, hypocrisy is part of it. But there's got to be larger issues, or am I missing something?
I think it is simply people who no longer feel what they're learning about in their faith tradition is being manifested in spiritual communities. And so they're finding that meaning elsewhere. So it's simply a fact that, I remember being in the church and thinking, as a pastor, there is this radical, compassionate welcoming of the neighbor. There's this inviting in of all people. And yet in America, I was not seeing that. And so there's a disenchantment with the whole system. And I think you do that long enough, and there are patterns that develop of people's behavior where the church is just no longer a part of life the way it was 3 or 4 or 5 decades ago. And so now there's just a group of these. This is why I get to reach this beautiful congregation of what I call the church of not being horrible. And that's what people want.
I'm curious your thoughts on the growth of progressive churches. When I was young, I used to attend the Unity Church, the Unitarian Church, which arguably would not even call itself a church. As I recall, it's the United Church of Christ. Is that the one that was running the ads welcoming gay people into their churches during the first Trump administration?
Yes.
How are they doing? How are these more progressive denominations doing?
I think by nature, progressive Christianity does not seek power and control, and it's not built on leveraging fear. And when you have fear, I remember a pastor talking to me years ago who had become more progressive, and he said, "John, I really miss hell." He said, "When I had hell, I could manipulate people. I could get them to vote and to show up and to volunteer and to give." And I think progressive faith communities are by their nature quieter and more welcoming of difference. And so I think progressive communities struggle because they don't have that desire to have market share. And so the challenge for progressive communities of faith is to make sure they have a message that is clear and compelling and distinct from their counterparts. And that would be social justice, equality, and really a Jesus-centric embracing of all people.
As a 30-year pastor in the United Methodist Church, what would you say to somebody who started going off on America is a Christian nation, always has been, always will be? We've got to, just the shtick that we hear coming out of the Christian nationalist movement in the United States. How specifically should those of us who are out here, average people, be talking to our neighbors about this kind of stuff if and when it comes up?
Well, I think the heart of it, Tom, is that religion of any kind is an individual personal decision. And the whole movement of Jesus was a calling to a certain way of community, of being in the world, of loving neighbor, of caring for the poor and the sick and the marginalized. It had nothing to do with building a religion or accruing power or ruling by force. And so we can simply direct those conservative Christians or those misguided Christians back to the life and teachings of Jesus and say, tell me where he's talking about any of that. You know, the teaching is God so loved the world, not God wanted America to be great. And I think if we can bring them back to their faith tradition, we can let that faith tradition do the work for us.
Brilliant. John Pavlovitz, a writer, pastor, activist from Wake Forest, North Carolina. His latest book, Stuff That Needs to Be Said. His newsletter over on Substack is titled The Beautiful Mess. John Pavlovitz, Pavlovitz.substack.com. You can easily find it at Substack. It's free. You should join. You should sign up now. You're going to love it. John, thanks so much for dropping by.